Gentlemen, may I have your attention, please? The show starts in 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, go.
Good afternoon and welcome to the Right Fit Podcast. I'm your host, Daryl Jacobs. Join me every Friday noon Eastern Time with decision makers, both in collegiate athletics and professional sports. But joining me today is the president and CEO of LEAD1 Association, the Honorable Mr. Tom McMillen. Tom, welcome to the Right Fit.
Daryl, it's great to be with you. Thanks so much.
Thank you for taking the time out of your busy schedule, and I know you're doing a lot with LEAD1, and I'm very excited to have you on. And so some of the coaches and administrators were looking forward to this podcast here. But before we get started with the Q&A, Tom, briefly talk about your journey into the collegiate athletics. I know you've done so many things in politics as well as pro basketball and some other things, but talk about your journey into collegiate athletics.
Well, I was very involved in collegiate athletics when I was in Congress. I wrote a book called Out of Bounds at the time. It talked about the greed and hypocrisy of the American sports establishment. I sponsored some bills. Your senator, Bill Bradley, and I, and Congressman Ed Towns, we passed the Student Right to Know bill, which required schools to disclose graduation rates of not only their students, but of their student athletes. And that was pretty, believe it or not, radical at the time. But we worked on that. We got it passed. And there were other bills that I worked on involving college sports as well. While I was in Congress, I was asked to serve on the inaugural Knight Commission. That was the group that formed and still going that tries to put reform agendas forward for college sports. And so I've always been involved in college sports. I was a trustee at the University of Maryland, the Naval Academy, and so I've been involved in higher ed. And then I was recruited to take this position in 2015. And that's kind of how it all came full circle.
Wow, that's an amazing story, your background and having always been involved with collegiate athletics. Most people want to know, for those who don't know, particularly coaches, what is LEAD1 Association and how did it come about?
It was formed in 1986. Homer Rice was the legendary AD in Georgia, and he created this association of all the FBS athletic directors, meaning the football bowl subdivision of the NCAA. That's all the schools with big-time football. Right now, that's 130 schools. And so the organization existed for years, and Jack Swarbrick of Notre Dame, the athletic director at Notre Dame, became the head of it. And he wanted to focus more on policy. He wanted LEAD1 to be more of a policy organization, a thought leader than it had been before. And so the executive director at the time was retiring, and so they reached out, and that's how I got involved. And so what we do is we work on a lot of the issues in college sports, whether it's transfers or NIL or paying student athletes as employees. We even looking at the governance of college football. Where should football be in the scheme of things, governance wise? So we work on all those issues, and that's sort of our mandate today.
And that takes me into my next questions about some of the type of initiatives you're currently working on or have done. If you want to care to expound on that a little bit as well.
Well, we've worked on a lot of things. One that we spent a lot of time on was our diversity in DEI initiative, which was something we worked on for about a year. We had a very big work group. We had about 25 staff and our ADs who got together, and we tried to come up with some actionable recommendations that would make a difference in the whole diversity picture of college sports. And so that was released. That white paper was released. It's on our website. Uh, we worked on NIL for months, giving our different comment letters to the NCAA on what our work group thought was appropriate about NIL. And we've worked on transfers. We've worked on so many different issues. So we really publish those work papers on our website, and it shows the kind of extent of the effort we have really put in on so many different issues across the landscape of college sports.
And I've read those white papers, and they've been tremendous. And we'll get to talk a little bit about the NIL when we talk about the industry trends. I'm sure we can get back to that. Let's talk about a little bit about the interview process. I know you've been involved in so many. Over the last 5 years, how has that changed? And when it comes to hiring of coaches and athletic administrators?
Well, one of the things I think the job of being an athletic director is so different than it was even 5 years ago. The skill set required is quite vast. I mean, they have to have marketing experience, finance experience, fundraising experience. They have to have good political skills. It's a real people business, and they have to be good managers. They've got to run these organizations, which have gotten extraordinary, much larger. I mean, think of some of our schools have 150, 200 million in revenue, and that doesn't account for the impact that school has. I mean, a $200 million athletic department is a really big organization because of its impact across the community. And so we have schools that are, in the 20s and schools that are up around the $200 million revenue. And so being an AD today is much more complicated. We find some of our ADs have legal degrees, some have accounting degrees. Many of them have worked in development and fundraising, because that's a big part of the job now, continuing to bring in resources to fund your program. So it's a very different, even during the period that I've been at LEAD1 for about 6 years, the criteria for ADs has changed. It's much different. Of course, there's a lot of emphasis on diversity today. I mean, I see real intentional emphasis on that. And we're beginning to see more and more candidates, as well as folks from diverse backgrounds winning or being accepted into these positions. So it's been a lot of change in the last 5 years.
And particularly over the last 2 years, as you know, besides working with ESPN, I'm executive director for diversity and inclusion for the Rising Coaches DEI Alliance. And some of the initiatives we actually worked on, and looking at some of your white papers that you have put out has helped us move some things forward, as well. During the interview process, I always ask my guests, talk about some of the do's and don'ts when it comes to the interview processes, whether it's a coach or administrator.
Well, I would say your demeanor should be humble but confident. Those are not contradictory phrases. You can be humble, but yet you can be confident. I think that's very important. I would also say that you better do your homework whenever you go into an interview. You need to know everybody in the room and everything about them. You need to know their backgrounds. Matter of fact, you should think ahead and anticipate questions that they might ask you. And most of all, you better know everything about the institution or the program that you're being interviewed for. I mean, you got to come in and do your homework. So, I've been in a lot of interviews, both as a trustee and in other places, where some candidates haven't been as prepared as they should be. And it's really quite evident. And when they are prepared and they have an idea what they want to do with the job, that makes all the difference in the world. I mean, people are going after positions because obviously they want to make a difference. And some people are better prepared than others for that. In other words, some really think it through and come to the table prepared. Others don't do as well at that. So those are some do's and don'ts that I would strongly stress.
Would you say there's a lot now of people or decisions being made based on transferable skills? Sometimes there was always an emphasis to have a certain skill set or a certain area of expertise. Would you say transferable skills is something that is kind of trending now in terms of the hiring process?
Yes, I mean it's interesting. We've had some non-traditional hires in college sports, people that came from other backgrounds, of, legal or business or whatever. Um, and like any situation, some have worked out, some haven't. But more likely than not, you find candidates that have risen through the ranks and have done different experiences at different schools. And so, as I said, I think that's the more typical pathway, although there have been, as I said, non traditional candidates as well who've done very well. Um, the one thing I will say is that the complexity level of college sports is much greater today than it was 10 years ago. I mean, you've got so many issues, and you're constantly having to consult with lawyers because there's just a million legal issues that have to be juggled.
Tom, I'm really enjoying this conversation. Let's take a commercial break. I got to pay some bills here before I get in trouble. You're watching and listening to The Right Fit here with Mr. Tom McMillen.
The Right Fit podcast is brought to you by Rising Coaches Search and Consulting. Tired of spending what seems like all of your time and budget filling coaching vacancies? Let Rising Coaches Search and Consulting handle your next coaching search. Our process is simple. We identify, vet, and recruit a talented and diverse group of professionals that fits your institution's profile, all for a low price that we guarantee will beat our competitions. Plus, all of your searches will be handled by former coaches, meaning we will get the best possible insight on all of your candidates, and you'll get the perspective that only a former coach could provide. For testimonials, a full client list, or more information, please visit risingcoaches.com.
Welcome back to the Right Fit Podcast. I'm your host, Darryl Jacobs. I'm with my guest, the Honorable Mr. Tom McMillen, President and CEO at LEAD1 Association, and we're talking about the right fit. One of the things you hit on earlier, Tom, was the NLI. And my next question was talking about those industry trends. I would like for you to talk a little bit further about NLI as being one of those industry trends. And of course, if there's any other trends you want our listeners or viewers to be abreast of as well.
Well, name, image, and likeness obviously is a very big industry development over the last year or so. Since it was passed, we've had really kind of this Wild West scenario where there aren't too many rules and a lot of people are experimenting and trying different things. And now the NCAA has just recently announced that they're going to have to start putting some kind of rules to the road here, particularly when it comes to recruiting. Because now, the idea that you can give these kids these tremendous NIL payments and directly serves as a recruiting inducement. And that was never intended to be the case. It was supposed to be young people able to monetize their publicity rights and make some money off it. But it wasn't supposed to be used as a recruiting carrot. And that's what it's being used for. So one of the trends, obviously, is that coaches have to watch is that, your competitors may be very well using NIL as a recruiting tool. And although the NCAA, has frowned upon that and said that's against their interim policy, the question is, will they really enforce it? It's like you're speeding through a town and there's no policemen. Well, you wonder whether anybody will make a difference on that. And so that's kind of wait and see. We're waiting to see whether the NCAA will really step in and really put a halt to some of these recruiting inducements. I think our ADs quite unanimously feel that NIL and student athletes earning some money on the side for that, it makes a lot of sense. But when it crosses into, recruiting and even the pay for play, where I'm going to pay you and I'm going to give you more if you play well, those are the kinds of slippery slopes that I think college sports is concerned about. And so uh, as I said, there's a lot happening in this space, and we also have a lot of undercurrents about turning student athletes into employees, and there's a lot of complications to that. I think most of our ADs understand that football and basketball players probably deserve more and in benefits, whether that's healthcare, safety, or even revenue in some cases. But where they don't want to see college sports turn into a mirror image of the NFL and the NBA. And we're talking basically about basketball and football here for the most part. The other sports are, it's great for a young person to be able to monetize their name, image, and likeness if they're on a softball team or whatever. But the real pressure, I think, tipping point areas are in football and basketball. And that's going to require some creativity so that, you still have a college model that's different than the NBA and the NFL model. And tied to education is clearly one of the hallmarks of college sports. And when you get to an employee status, it's harder to have that tie to education. I mean, because if you're not playing well in the pros, you get fired. So what happens in college? Do these kids get fired? What are the consequences of all that? And so the employment issue is a very, very tricky issue.
Well, as a former congressman, a lot of people are looking for Congress. I mean, you served in Congress, and you're in Washington now. You can be down there to exact change. Do you think Congress will jump in and assist the NCAA? Because they seem to be moving slow. They seem like they put a rule in to just deal with the collective, which is boosters.
Right.
And I can't understand how they didn't foresee some of this happening. Even us, I'm a former college coach for over 20 years, and we saw this coming. We saw that some of the bigger schools with the bigger boosters was going to be using this as a recruiting inducement,
Right.
with no legalities or boundaries to it, as well. And you see some of the things going on right now with some of the players, even with certain deals, and you see it in the news like, I want to go to this school, transfer to this school because I can get a better NIL deal. But do you think Congress would jump in and assist the NCAA? Because they seem to be moving very slow on that, particularly what they just came out with, just dealing with the boosters who are the collective.
I think it's probably unlikely that Congress will do anything this term. With the Ukrainian war and all the other issues going on, the elections coming up in November, it's going to be hard to have Congress focus on this. There's a few members that are focused on it. And a lot of people understand that having a national standard, a harmonious standard, makes sense. But then there are some others, particularly on the Democratic side, who say, look, if we're going to fix NIL, we need to fix the bigger issue of giving these student athletes a bigger piece of the pie and making them employees and giving them collective bargaining. So part of the problem is getting consensus on the issue. How the Congress changes or in the next election could have some impact on this. So I don't think you're going to see any action this Congress, but into the next Congress, it could very well be the case. Pending that, the NCAA is going to have to stand up and do some things. And there's always risk of litigation. I mean, think about, you said it right, Daryl, when you said this was very easy to foresee. Here, they basically passed these rules, and then the states did it as well. It said the schools can't be involved. Well, of course, the vacuum was going to be filled by boosters, and of course it was. And you can't imagine the NFL or the NBA basically allowing boosters to have such a relationship with their players and who are the most vital asset of the organization, and really having your hands off of it. It didn't make sense the way it was constructed in the beginning, and certainly you probably could have foreseen this, as you said. I think in the long run, it would be better if these collectives were brought into the school. I mean, there's nothing wrong with the school having a division for its student athletes that where they can manage it and control it and make sure it's done right. Putting it to third-party boosters, I think, is very, very, very complicated. In all cases, you're going to have Title IX issues. So, why not be upfront about it and deal with it in the school and where you have control of it? And you really can watch the welfare of your student athletes better than if you have this marketing organization on the outside, which you really pretty much hands off on. So I think that down the road, you're going to see a lot of these collectives get merged back into the school.
Yeah, you're beginning to see a lot of departments beginning to move towards what you just said, to get their arms wrapped around it and controlling the student athletes in terms of their brand and hopefully keeping everything as far as compliance is concerned. And that's another issue to go down the road as well. Let's talk a little bit about, we talked about NLI and we talked about NCAA bylaws, and talk about some of those job opportunities that might be on the rise in collegiate athletics, given that there are so many new trends coming out now.
Well, the world is changing so dramatically. Licensing is going to be a big part of the knowledge set. Schools are pretty good at it anyway, but that's going to be another area. Just think about artificial intelligence. You're going to be able to crunch enormous amounts of data that's going to be predictive of how your team's going to do. It's also going to be very predictive for recruiting.
Well, that's already there now.
It's already there. But you asked me where job opportunities are.
Right.
There's going to be AI opportunities, both used for recruiting. You're going to be able to put AI on these recruits and tell and really predict who's going to succeed, who's not going to succeed, who may get injured. It's incredible, the amount of data crunching. So data is going to be an important part of all this. Health and safety issues are going to continue to be important. And there's going to require expertise in all that. Legal is a growth industry in college sports. So there's so many things. Wearables, the
right.
Technology. I throw technology as a big umbrella because these programs are morphing into very sophisticated operations. So there's going to always be opportunities for those skilled in those particular areas.
When I talk to coaches, a lot of times today, when talking to a lot of coaches, Tom, when they're recruiting or looking at the portal, and I always told them when NII come up, you better become an expert in NLI. You need to see where your resources come, because if you don't get your arm wrapped around it, don't have an understanding of it, that's going to become your chief detriment in terms of recruiting, because kids are looking to monetize their brand as well. When it comes to candidate, talk about how can a candidate differentiate themselves or stand out during the interview process?
Again, knowledge is powerful. There are so many trade publications in college sports today. The D1 ticker, there's so many of them that you could spend hours a day reading this stuff. And if you really are interested, that's what you should do. You should be so knowledgeable for two reasons. One, I think that impresses the people who are interviewing you. And secondly, it also is a very important part of your management style, that you are well informed, that you know what your competitors are doing. And so I think knowledge is key here. It's the most important thing that you can do because it also shows that you have the breadth to be able to look at situations and to make reasoned decisions about them. So that would be the one thing I would is do your homework. Make sure that you really are up on the industry because it's changing so quickly, as we know.
Tom, this is the best part of my show. I always love my last question. It's called word association. I'll say a place, person, or thing, and you say the first thing that comes to mind here. So, and I always preference when I tell people, if you got anybody watching, you don't want to alienate anybody or say anything that could be detrimental. But let's start with the University of Maryland.
University of Maryland. great public institution.
Politics.
Very fractionated.
Somehow,
Very polarized. Yeah.
collegiate athletics.
Fraught with issues.
And
But
finally,
but important to retain.
And finally, LEAD1 Association.
Thought leader.
Tom, thank you for taking the time this afternoon. I want to thank all my viewers and listeners for joining us as well. Join me next Friday for another great guest here on The Right Fit. Until then, please stay healthy, stay safe, and have a wonderful weekend.